Hey everyone, Guppy Girl here, and I am now in Atlanta, Georgia. If you watched my past fish room tour video, the most recent one, you'll kind of see my new setup now. And I am currently working on resetting up my fallen pot tank, which is the clip you see here. This is an older clip from January of this year, 2022, and now I'm working on recreating it. But since I have so much footage of the old stuff and me setting it up and all my trials and tribulations when I was working on the tank for the very first time, I decided I would go over that with you guys and then show you the breakdown of the tank, which was very depressing for me, and then the recreation of it, which is what I'm working on right now. The very first day I started putting things into the tank was in June of 2021. But before that, I had always been kind of thinking about how I wanted to create the tank and the theme. So for me, my theme was Alice in Wonderland. At least that's how it started off. I was thinking that the Coolie Loaches would be like the treasure cat tail that's always popping up in the movie, kind of ominous, but always there, showing up at weird points. And the blue lace snakeskin guppies would be a good fit to kind of be Alice, even though there's more than one guppy in here and there's only one Alice, obviously, in the movie. Their nice light blue flowy tail reminded me of her dress. In my mind, the whole backdrop or scene I wanted the tank to depict was where she met the caterpillar and he's on top of a mushroom smoking something. Just that scene in the movie was kind of like what I wanted to recreate. Now, of course, we don't have giant mushrooms in the aquarium hobby, and I did want it to still look natural without adding too many artificial elements to the tank. So I went back to thinking, I can't remember, she took some type of pill, she got small, and everything else was huge, and she was like in a garden or forest or something. So that's basically what led me to thinking I want the whole tank to be a zoomed in picture of like a forest floor or garden floor. That's kind of been neglected and plants have been taking over. When I was coming up with the plant selection for the tank, I knew I wanted clovers, like small delicate looking plants, ferns, and grasses. I wanted to stay away from things like Rotala and Litwigia because to me they look very aquatic, and I wanted my plants to look more terrestrial to fit the theme that this is like a garden floor. I did some small changes, I'll go over that later, but in general, like I really put a lot of thought into this tank before I set it up and put everything all together. So it took me about 2 weeks to figure out the placement for all the hardscape, mainly just working with the branches and finding the right branches, since I have a giant bucket full of twigs and stuff. So it was like just a lot of trial and error every day. I'd come back, look at the hardscape, figure out does anything need to be adjusted and whatnot. Eventually I came up to this, more or less this plan. And I stuck everything together with tape just to hold it together. When it came to filling up the tank with water afterwards and tying wood together, I used fishing line. And the reason for the pad underneath the pot was so that in case a little pebble or stone got underneath there, it wasn't going to crack the glass, because I did have a plan of putting a lot of heavy stones in the pot, so I was worried about a little piece of rock cracking the glass from all the weight on top of it. I filled the tank up with 88 aqua soil that was already used in someone else's tank. I don't know how long they used it for, but it was used, and I was like, well, it still works. So I put a layer of that, put a layer of the pool filter sand down, and proceeded to fill the tank up with water. Now, if you ever worked with any aqua soil, it releases a lot of just dirt and particles in the water, so the water was pretty brown after filling it up the first time, so I did one more water change, filled the tank up all the way, and then the water was pretty much crystal clear. Then I put the pot in the tank and all of the wood, I just threw it in there so eventually it would become waterlogged and sink. But of course, wood doesn't sink immediately, so I had to leave it in there for a while. Believe it or not, I actually left the tank alone like this, filled with water, wood, and pots and substrate for 2 months without any light, without any filter. I just let it sit there and do its thing. Of course, naturally, because there's bacteria and stuff in the soil, it was going to populate the whole tank with beneficial bacteria over time. Of course, this takes a while, and I wasn't in any rush since I had other projects I was doing, so I just let this tank just chill out and sit like that for 2 months without any light. If you put light during this stage, you're going to grow a lot of algae, so just that's a little warning. 2 months later, the wood, it was all sunken. It did not take 2 months for the wood to sink, but that was the point when I was ready to work on the tank. So I did a full water change since the water was kind of yellowish colored from the tannins released from the wood. After doing the first water change, I realized that the sand looked pretty nasty. It wasn't white anymore. There was a lot of diatom algae and other particulate matter in the sand. So I just took an aquascaping tool and brushed the very top layer just to get all that stuff up out of the sand bed and into the water column. Then I slapped on a hang-on back filter onto the tank with a polishing filter pad to remove this very fine particulate matter, which is one of the reasons why I really love hang-on back filters, because they're so easy to modify. The next day, I started adding plants to the tank. I want to preface that I am not 100% sure of these plant names because many of my plants I bought from hobbyists, so it's whatever name I have that they gave me basically, and I Google reference pictures, but I'm not 100% sure on these names, just a heads up. The first day I attached 2 different types of Bulbitis to some of the wood in the back. These species were Bulbitis deformis and the Bulbitis deformis mini. I knew they would both get very large, so that's another reason I put them in the back area. The second plant that I put in the tank was a species of dwarf hairgrass called Elacaris acularis, and that didn't do too well. It didn't grow, but it didn't die either, so it was just hanging in there and was a resident of the tank. I also placed Bacopa caroliniana, also known as Bacopa colorata, in the right-hand back corner because I wanted that to get large and cover up the filter behind it. In the picture, you can see the Bacopa is kind of a lime green color, and then there's a slightly darker, more emerald colored plant next to it. I ended up taking this one out because it just wanted to grow right out of the tank, and I did not want that. I don't know the name of it, but you can see a little trimming of it in the picture. I had many cuttings of Anubias nana petite, which I tried to incorporate into the aquascape. Later I decided it was just too much and I didn't like the leaf shape for this whole theme, but in this picture you can see there is a lot of Anubias nana petite. And then in the lower left hand corner I have S. repens. This plant ended up being really difficult to maintain. It just was always getting yellow leaves with holes and really struggled in this tank. It didn't completely die out, but it wasn't happy, that's for sure. And then the plant sticking up out of the top, I have constantly been putting new trimmings in the tank because it outgrows the tank over time, but that plant is red emerald philodendron. For me personally, I really like taking pictures of my tank and then drawing over them with the phone picture editing tool. I think most smartphones have this nowadays where you can like kind of draw over. So I like doing that to just figure out plant placement, and as you can see, this was like one of the ideas I had while after I finished planting the first day. I ended up deciding not to put plants on top because it covered up too much of the pot in my opinion, but these are just like my thinkings as I went through with the scape, so you can see my thought process. Nothing is perfect on the first try, and this is just an example of that statement because as you can see, this tank is looking a lot different from day 1 to day 2 of planting. I already decided that I didn't like all the Anubias on top of the pot. I thought it was just covering up too much of it, so I removed that. I also added 2 little pieces of Hydrocotyle tripartita in the front, along with Bucephalandra Godzilla in the back near the bulbitis, and another Bucephalandra mini red, which is on top of the pot. I liked the idea of having something on top of the pot, so I added a Java Fern Windelov on top to see if that would work out. In terms of hardscape, I added large river stones inside the pot and some smaller ones sprinkled around outside the pot. And inside the pot, I was also doing this little experiment because I had grown pearlweed in my other tanks and it spreads like a weed if it's not checked. And I didn't want to have it in the main area of my tank in the front because I knew it would just take over and cover everything. So I decided to make a small little sack of aqua soil in a pantyhose and then place that next to a couple cuttings of pearlweed inside the pot in hopes that it would keep the pearlweed separate from the other plants and it wouldn't get everywhere all over the tank and take over. And the funniest thing is that actually worked. The pearlweed eventually got roots and it started going into the little pantyhose with all of the aqua soil. So now that I know that, I'm definitely going to use this technique in the future. I thought that was really interesting. I'm always running little experiments, and that is a new technique I learned now. Another experiment I was trying with this tank was I had some Monte Carlo growing on a little piece of coarse filter pad out of the water, and it was working for a little while until the duckweed completely smothered it, and then as I was removing duckweed over time, I was ending up pulling out little pieces of the Monte Carlo, so in the end it never spread and eventually vanished, but that was something I was also trying out with this tank. After a few days, the Java Fern Windelov started getting little brown holes in the leaves and overall decaying, so I took it out of the tank. It just wasn't a good fit and wasn't happy there. On the 11th day of the tank being fully set up, I added 1 autosynclus catfish. He was the only guy left I had from a group a few years ago, so I decided he'd be good in here with all the plants. On day 27, I did a 40% water change, which was the second water change that the tank ever had a month after the first one. So I did a larger water change on this round. And I also added my blue lace snakeskin guppy colony to this tank, which was just a few fish. And I added about 20 neocaridina shrimp of orange and yellow colors. I wasn't concerned about having an ammonia spike because the tank had already been set up for 2 months before, sitting in water and sticks and all of the tannins in the water. So it was collecting bacteria and colonizing the whole tank at that point in time. And then I had the plants sitting in the tank for about a month without having any fish except for that 1 autosynclus. So I wasn't concerned that the tank wasn't balanced. I knew it was balanced at this point. I did dose fertilizer a little more than the usual now that I go back in the footage. I dosed 8 drops of C-Chem comprehensive supplement and 24 drops of C-Chem potassium. And this was just the very first fertilization that I used on this tank. I also started dosing Vitachem for my guppies. I had been dosing their own individual tanks before I moved them here, and now since they were in this tank, I started dosing it for them. Check out part 2 for the rest of the history of this tank and for the final breakdown of it.